In this video, you are going to learn everything you need to know about arrow functions within JavaScript. We're going to talk about two of the kind of key differences between arrow functions and normal functions, including syntactical differences, as well as differences in the binding of the this keyword. And then we are going to finish up on some common use cases of arrow functions within JavaScript and as well as in React. So first things first, what are some of the key syntactical differences of arrow functions and just regular functions? Well, let's first start with defining just a regular function. And here, when defining this regular function, this is just a function expression. If you haven't seen my videos on functions, I describe function expressions, name function expressions, function declarations, and the differences between those. So I would definitely recommend that if you're not familiar with kind of what's going on here. But here I'm basically just assigning a function to this constant add numbers. Now, if I want to make this an arrow function, what I need to do here is, so you can see I have everything's very similar, except after the equal sign, when I'm assigning this to a function here, I don't need to use a function keyword. I can just open up a pair of parentheses here, and then following these parentheses, I use an equal sign and a right arrow. And this effectively tells JavaScript that this is an arrow function. And then here I have the arrow kind of point to my function body. So I open up a pair of curly braces, and then I have my return statement here, just like my kind of function expression. But the main differences here are just that instead of using the function keyword, we get rid of that. And then here I use an arrow or an equal sign and a right arrow to then notate that this is indeed an arrow function. If I run this here, you're going to see I get the value of 3. So I call this add numbers function, pass in 1 and 2 as my arguments, and that evaluates to the value of 3, just like you would expect from a regular function. Now, arrow functions also have a couple more syntactical differences that you definitely will see. So one of them is called implicit return. And an implicit return, if I just have one expression in the body of my function, I don't need to use a return statement, and I don't need to use these curly braces here. I can forego the curly braces, and I can move this up to one line here. And this is actually going to give me the same result here. So I'll run this, and you can see I get the very same result. Now, what's going on here is that since I just have a single expression here and I use an arrow function, JavaScript is going to implicitly add a return statement right here, and it's going to return num1 plus num2. And I don't need to use the curly braces. Now, say you have maybe a more complex expression like a ternary operator or something like that, and you want it on a separate line. Well, all you need to do is open up a pair of parentheses instead of your curly braces, and this will also give you the same result. So here, I still get the result of 3. Because if I use parentheses here, then I can implicitly return on this separate line. And JavaScript effectively adds a return statement here. Now, one thing to keep in mind with implicit returns is that you can only return one single expression here. You cannot write a statement within your implicit return. So here, I have a function, and then I have if num1 is greater than num2, return num1 plus num2. So I am using a statement right here. And right now this is valid because I use this pair of curly braces here to tell JavaScript that, hey, this is going to have a normal function body, and then I need to use a return keyword within that body. But if I wanted to do an implicit return here and just use a pair of parentheses, you're going to see I get an error because I can't use a statement within an implicit return. It says expression expected. This has to just be one single expression. So I need to actually remove this statement here. And then since it's an implicit return, I need to remove the return keyword, and then we're back to the same function I had earlier. So with an arrow function and you use an implicit return, you can only use one expression. You cannot use statements within that implicit return. Now, Another thing to remember with implicit returns is that if you try to implicitly return an object, you might not get the behavior you expect. So here I have a function called return an object. It takes no arguments here, and then it returns. So this points to the body of my function, and then I return an object right here. So this is going to work as you would expect. This works like any other function in which I return this object right here. Now, what if I want to implicitly return this? So let me get rid of my curly braces defining the function of my body, and I just try to return this object right here. Well, JavaScript has no way of knowing that I'm trying to return an object right here. JavaScript is like, hey, you're opening the body of your arrow function right here. Because as I pointed out earlier, when I had my add numbers function, I can do an implicit return here, but I can also open up a pair of curly braces like a normal function and just use a return statement here. So JavaScript is like, hey, this arrow is pointing to the body of a function. It's not pointing to an object here. And it's thinking the same thing right here. It's saying you're pointing to the body of your function. You're not pointing to an object. So how do we fix this here? Well, you can just wrap this in parentheses. And then it will return this object as expected. So as you can see there, it returns the object. Now, I think in this example, it actually makes sense to do the implicit return on a separate line. So you have parentheses and then you return an object here. I think that probably makes a little bit more sense. And this gets us the same result as you can see. So when you try to implicitly return an object, you must wrap that object in parentheses because JavaScript won't be able to differentiate the difference between an object and just trying to open the body of your arrow function. Now, one last syntactical difference between arrow functions and regular functions is if you only use one parameter in your arrow function, you actually can forego the parentheses altogether. So right here, I define a constant, return number plus 1, and then here, this defines an arrow function with an implicit return taking num plus 1. And I run this, you're going to see that I do indeed get 6. I pass in 5 as my argument and it returns 5 plus 1. So if you only have one parameter, you can indeed just forego the parentheses. Now, I don't really recommend this because I think that seeing this in your program, it can kind of be tricky to realize that you are defining a function here and then assigning it to this label. I think that can be a little bit more tricky, and I tend to think that this is more readable. So if you have one parameter, you definitely can still wrap it in parentheses, and I tend to still go that route because I find that more readable. Now, if you use multiple parameters here, and I tried to do num2, and I didn't use parentheses, you get an error. So you can only forego the parentheses when you do indeed have one parameter. So I'll just return that here and I'll comment that out. So those are the syntactical differences, but there's also a difference under the hood with the binding of the this keyword. And arrow functions do not bind this keyword. So the this keyword will resolve lexically, meaning that the this keyword will evaluate to when using an arrow function wherever you wrote that function. Whereas if you just use a regular function and you use a this keyword, the this object will evaluate to where that function is being called. It will evaluate dynamically. So let me take you through a couple examples here. So in this first example, I have an object called coding language, and I have a property name assigned to JavaScript, a property programmers assigned to a large number, and a property details assigned to a function. And it returns the name of this object has the amount of programmers. So this should read JavaScript has this large number programmers. So if I run this here, I get JavaScript has a large number programmers. And I cancel out the this object here, and you can see that this object is going to evaluate to this coding language object. And it does this because when I call this details function, well, the this keyword is going to be resolved dynamically to whatever is left of this dot. And I'll create a video on the this keyword and explain that in much more detail. But when using just a regular function, the this keyword is going to resolve dynamically, and it's going to resolve to whatever object is to the left of the dot in which you call this method on. So since I call this function with coding language to the left of the dot, the this keyword is going to resolve to coding language. And I get the result that I would expect here. And my this keyword is this object here. Now, if I use an arrow function here, I actually don't get the same result because the this keyword is going to resolve lexically. It's going to resolve not to what is left of the dot, but it's actually going to try to look up into its parent function scope to find the object that it's within. So here I have the very same object, and the only difference is I use an arrow function here to assign it to the details property. And if I run this here, and we just look at the output of this, we're going to see I get undefined has undefined programmers. And what's going on here is that this arrow function isn't going to bind a this keyword to whatever is left of the dot. It's not going to resolve dynamically here. It's going to resolve lexically. So if we look up into the function scope here of where this function is written, so the outer function here, well, it's not within a function right now. The outer function is actually just the global function in my program. So my global function, it doesn't have a property called name or programmers. And in a browser, if I was running this in a browser, this would actually be the window object. That is kind of your global object. And on the window object, you're not going to have a this.name or this.programmers. So when I run this, I just get undefined has undefined programmers because the this keyword looks up into its parent function, and the parent function doesn't have a name and programmers. This object doesn't create a new this scope. A this scope is only created by a new function. So it's going to look up into its parent function scope, and it's not going to find a this.name or this.programmers. So it's going to resolve to undefined because it's going to resolve lexically. It's not going to care about what is left of the dot here. Now, this can also be a feature though, and you might want this in some situations. So if you return a function from another function, so here I have the very same object, but I define a function, and then in that function, I return another function, and then I say this.name has this.programmers. Well, when I do this here, and this might be more clear when I go to run this. So if I console log coding language.details, and when I just call this once, that's actually just going to return a function. So details, when I call this once, it's going to return a function. But then if I want to get this output here, I have to call that function again. So in JavaScript, I can just add another pair of parentheses, and I can call this inner function here after I return this outer function. Now, when we look at this, when I eventually call this function and I evaluate my this dynamically, what is to the left of the dot here? Well, there's nothing left of the dot, which means that this is going to resolve to the global function, which is actually going to give us the same result that we had here in our arrow function. As this first function, yeah, this function right here, it's going to have a this keyword that is going to resolve to the coding language object. So if I console logged like this right here, it's still going to be this coding language object. But when I console log this other this in here, it's going to try to evaluate to whatever is to the left of this second call, which is actually nothing, because coding language is only to the left of this first call. So if I run this, you're going to see that in my first this console, I get name JavaScript programmers is a large number, and then details is a function. So this is going to cancel out what is left of the dot right here. But then when I try to console log the this keyword here, well, there's nothing to the left of this dot. So I'm actually going to get the global object here. So as you can see, I get this global object. And that means that I'm going to get undefined has undefined as my return value here. Now, one way to fix this is actually using an arrow function. So if I get rid of all this, what you can see is that if I return an arrow function instead of a normal function, since an arrow function is this keyword, it doesn't bind to this keyword, it's going to resolve lexically. That means that right here, the this, well, it's going to look to its parent function. And what is the parent function here? Well, the parent function is this details function here. And when I call details, what is to the left of the dot? Well, it's coding language. So here, I'm going to actually get what I want because the this is going to evaluate to its parent function's this keyword, which when I call details, the this keyword is going to evaluate to whatever's left of the dot, which is coding language. So here, when I run this, I get my this is my coding language object, and then I get JavaScript as a lot of developers. So arrow functions, if you do certain things like this, you can indeed use this feature to your advantage. Now, I think one of the most useful things to remember here is that arrow functions, they have a different behavior for the this keyword. And if you're using this keyword a lot and you're not getting the output you expect, really try to think about what is happening with your this binding and are you affecting that with arrow functions? And then you can kind of reason through, okay, since my arrow function is going to define this lexically, that means I'm actually not going to get what I expect here. Now let's move on to common use cases of arrow functions. So one of the most common use cases you'll see, well, for one, it's going to be when you want to kind of differentiate what the this keyword is. You can use it strategically to bind the this keyword to where you want it. But outside of that, one of the most common cases is as a callback function. So this is particularly common on the higher order functions like in arrays, the map, filter, reduce, find functions. I have videos on all those too that you can check out. But here I defined a nums array and then I do nums.map and then I pass an inline arrow function here. And I define this parameter in which every number of this array is going to be passed as an argument to this parameter. And then I implicitly return number times 10, and it's going to give me a new array of every number of this array times 10. And then I do a very similar thing here on line 83, in which I have a constant nums greater than 2, and I do nums.filter, and I pass in an inline function, and I return true if the number is greater than 2, which will give me, it will filter in every number greater than 2 to this array. So if I run this here, you're going to see that I get every number times 10 and then every number greater than 2 within those output arrays because I just passed in these inline anonymous arrow functions with this implicit return. So that is a very common use case for these. And then you'll also see them a lot within React to handle events. So here I create a React component and then I return a button that has a on-click attribute. And then right within this JSX here, I pass in an arrow function to handle this click. And here I just console log clicked, but you might have some more logic within this arrow function here. So you'll commonly see these arrow functions within event handlers within a library like React. So for arrow functions, they have like two key differences between normal functions within JavaScript. You'll see the syntactical differences in which you don't use a function keyword. You just define your parameters here, and then you use an arrow, and then you point to the body of your function. Also, you can just forego the curly braces altogether and implicitly return on one single line here, just like so. And JavaScript will implicitly effectively place a return statement there to return that single expression. But remember, it can only be with a single expression. You cannot implicitly return and then try to use an if statement or some conditional or a for loop or something like that. You can only use an implicit return with a single expression. And then if you want to return an object, you need to wrap parentheses around that object, and that will allow JavaScript to differentiate, are you returning an object here, or are you just creating the body of your arrow function? And then if you only have one parameter within your arrow function, you don't need to wrap it in parentheses. You can just place your parameter there without parentheses. I don't necessarily recommend this because I find it to be less readable, but that is something that you might see. Now, arrow functions, they also do not bind the this keyword, meaning that this keyword will resolve to its parent function where that function is written. It will resolve lexically. Whereas just a regular function, the this keyword will resolve dynamically to whatever is to the left of the dot. And then the most common use cases of arrow functions is when you want to specifically control the binding of this keyword in some way. You want to pass a callback function and have it to be kind of a nice, readable, single line function. Or also in React, if you're handling certain events within your components, you'll often see these arrow functions just passed anonymously to these event handlers. So I hope you take something away from this video here, and I will catch you in that next one.